So, coming to you from inside my house to do a kind of wrap up for this week's recitation. Sorry about all of the confusion with the course web and anyway, due dates. What's a due date, right? Everything's fine. And hopefully then this weekend, everything will go okay. And probably it'll just be the same thing. You guys, Thursday, Friday, but actually Saturday, Sunday, I don't care, can comment on the discussion boards. And then I will post a video like this again, just kind of as a review. I think in general, people did really well. I'm not going to try and answer every single question that was posted individually. That doesn't seem like a good use of any of our time. And also, I noticed that people in their replies to others were pretty effective a lot of times in sort of clarifying people's questions, right? So I'm just going to kind of treat this like a review of important points from this past week in the material. So first of all, we're dealing with Romanticism, which is fundamentally a movement. It's a cultural movement in a lot of ways, but for our purposes in terms of literature, it's a reaction against the Enlightenment, right? So you have all of these Enlightenment values of capital R reason, that we can know the truth, again, capital T of the world. We can know the truth of the world, and we will use our powers of reason to categorize, to analyze, to sift through data, to know the world with the purpose of controlling it. There are many people who think that, one, this project is impossible, and two, even if it were possible, it's undesirable, right? And so the backlash to these ideas about rationalizing everything, controlling everything, categorizing and dividing the world in this way, the backlash comes through in literature, certainly, in the arts in general, as this kind of romantic aesthetic. And so we get ideas about sublime nature, right? Nature beyond the control of man, certainly more powerful than we are. We get ideas about the true soul of the nation, right? So if the Enlightenment thinks that countries are no longer the divine right of kings, right? Countries are no longer what God has given kings to rule. Countries are made by these processes of nation states that we're familiar with thinking about as being connected to democracy, right? Consent of the governed, etc., various philosophies of the laws, right? For the Romantics, that's more about the soul of the folk. So in the Slavic tradition, this would sort of be why in the 19th century you see people going out and collecting the stories of the folk, right? Folk tales and fairy tales. They're interested in uncovering this authentic Slavic soul that defines the nation, right? The people define the nation. That's a romantic idea. And of course, the idea of the romantic hero, somebody who is not reasonable, somebody who is not rational. He is, you can't educate your way to being a romantic genius. You just are a genius. My cat has the zoomies in the background, if you can hear. I don't know if you can hear the noise, but Matilda is running around like an idiot. Anyway. Someone who is passionate, somebody who is a natural born genius, somebody who is artistically brilliant, burning the candle at both ends, deeply capable of love, etc., will probably die young, will probably die tragically. I mean, someone like Pushkin or someone like Lermontov both did this. They died in duels. Very stupid way to go. But in any case, right, so we've got this idea of Romanticism. On top of Romanticism, sort of wed to it, is the idea of Orientalism. Now, first of all, I want to say that Orientalism as an idea, as the term is used here, coined by Edward Said in the 1970s, his book, Orientalism, is probably one of the most important works in the humanities in the 20th century. This is the foundation of what we now think of as post-colonial studies. So condensing that into a few minutes is maybe folly. But his use of the idea of Orientalism is to say that Enlightenment thinking tends to divide the world. And we've already seen this, right? And it divides the world into binaries. And those binaries are not complementary. They are oppositional. And furthermore, they are ranked. And we already saw this when we talked about feminism, right? This idea that We've got the masculine and we've got the feminine, and the one category never intersects the other, and the one category is always inferior to the other. And in the same way, he says that we do this with masculine and feminine in Western Enlightenment culture. We do this with East and West. And the East always comes out looking inferior according to our values. So, the West is considered civilized and progressive, right? And the East is considered to be savage and atavistic. And in fact, the East is considered to be feminine, hyper-feminine, right? In the case of Eastern women, the West is considered to be masculine and rational. The Eastern is mystical. Now, none of this is true, right? I mean, what we are dealing with here, and this is actually an idea that goes clear back to the encounters between the Greeks and the Persians thousands of years ago, right? Europe has had many encounters with the East, the Crusades, through the Middle Ages, etc., etc. It's a way of processing ideas about difference, right? It is the case that the East, and of course the category of the East here is absurd. It's everything from Palestine to Japan in this conception, and obviously lumping those things together is foolish. But nevertheless, what we are talking about here is a Western conception, a Western idea. And so we have lumped the East together and we have described it in these very exoticizing, othering ways that are always noted as inferior compared to what we assign ourselves as being in the West. And of course, this is as much an identity building process in the West as it is anything else, right? It's how we define ourselves against the other. So, one thing is that this is a way of processing difference, trying to understand that which is different from oneself, and rather than just saying, oh, this is different. We have some things in common, we have some things not in common, there are cultural differences, there are things that seem very strange to us, there are things that seem very strange to them, there are things that seem very familiar between our cultures, right? There's a way to talk about difference in a neutral way. But this is a way to talk about difference in a way that creates an utter boundary between the self and the other, that exoticizes and even romanticizes it. And of course, ultimately, this is about power, because in the same way that that binary system of thinking about masculine and feminine sets up the justification for patriarchal power, Said says that the justification for colonial power, for imperialism, for the West invading and occupying the East throughout the 1800s and into the 20th century and ongoing, is created in this binary, right? So that you can have people standing up in the British Parliament and saying that, the Egyptians should be grateful that we're there to run their country for them, etc., right? We are bringing Iraq peace and freedom, etc., etc., etc. It becomes a justification for displays of power, right? So, in an Enlightenment context, we just have this setting up of this binary, this othering and exoticizing of the East. Now, the Enlightenment view of this is that, so the East is inferior. Got it. Now, of course, this is false and wrong and totally racist, but nevertheless, here we are. The Romantics agree with this binary. They don't question it. They don't question any underlying idea in this binary, but because they're rejecting the Enlightenment, they side with the East. They side with the Orient. They're like, yes, the East is mysterious and atavistic and feminine and sexual and exotic and backwards and uncivilized and natural and blah, 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 all of this, and we like it. And so the East, the Orient, as they construct it, and that's Said's term because it sort of denotes that kind of construction of what the East is, right? The East is a real thing. The Orient is a figment of the West's imagination. And so that Orientalism then gets fetishized in Romantic writing. So let's think about Lermontov. Let's think about Pushkin. So first of all, and I think people did an excellent job in the boards of just sort of identifying the romantic traits per se of a lot of these poems, right? Pushkin gives us these singular heroes, fierce he was from boyhood on, right? Tsar Dodon, etc., right? These people who are natural born geniuses, they are fierce and passionate. I mean, in the Golden Cockerel, he completely forgets that this woman has, just slaughtered his 2 children, right? Because he falls so passionately in lust for her. But so this takes us to some of the Orientalism, right? So here we have this queen from the East. She is brutal, she is barbaric, and she is hyper feminine, because remember, the East is feminine, whereas the West is masculine. So if you are an Eastern woman, then obviously, right, it's hypersexuality. She is so seductive that he just completely falls under her power. And of course, ultimately, she's also so nefarious. She's so untrustworthy. One of the traits that Said says the West ascribes to the East is this fundamental untrustworthiness, right? This kind of, they're sneaky. And it's something you see again and again in justifications for colonialism. So there's all these kinds of racist stereotypes that are ascribed to Easterners and that get picked up on here. Now, Pushkin is theoretically, as a romantic, sort of on the side, quote unquote, of the Orient, but nevertheless it recreates these racist stereotypes. So here is the queen. She is untrustworthy, she is tricksy, she is so sexy, she is brutal, she has aligned herself with a wizard, right? We have this strange mysticism, it's completely irrational, this magical power. And so that would be an example of how Orientalism is being deployed here, right? And of course, as Sheikh Karib, we bring in all of these elements. Lermontov himself spent a great deal of time in his youth in the Caucasus region, which was considered this sort of exotic place. He comes into contact with Muslim culture, and he uses those sorts of references in a very confused way. I mean, that Sheikh Karib is in many ways a mess, just in a literary sense. But we have references to St. George, we have references to Muhammad, we have references to all sorts of things, right? And all of this is brought up to create this air of the mystical and the backwards and the exotic, right? The romantic, right? And so Orientalism is interacting this way. And so a good critique of this we actually see in Parajanov, which his idea, whether you think this is successful or not, his idea in that clip is that he is going to recreate the Orientalist racist stereotypes of a Sheikh Karib, and he is going to turn that up to 11. And he himself is a Georgian, so he comes from this area of the Caucasus where Lermontov is getting inspired to write his Orientalist story. So, I mean, this is something that Parajanov sort of has a stake in himself as a person. In any case, right, the idea is you turn these stereotypes up to 11 and they just seem absurd, right? Like men walking around with pillows on their heads and pomegranates everywhere. I saw people pulling examples, right? This idea of these fabrics and this, all of these stereotypes, right? Like Aladdin. Someday we can talk about what a shit show Disney's Aladdin is, maybe. In this regard. I think I brought this up actually in Recitation at the time when we were critiquing Disney, and I was saying, man, wait till we get to Orientalism and you can think about Aladdin and what a shit show it is. Well, here it is. Anyway, right? And so by pointing out how absurd these stereotypes are, what he's hoping is that there's a trickle-down effect where you realize the entire thing is absurd. It's always been absurd. It's always absurdity. But the thing to remember for us in terms of the Romantics is that they don't reject any of this. They just pick the opposite side, right? And so, anytime you see an example in the material this week of, some figure comes from the East and they are some kind of magi, they are some kind of wizard, they are some kind of brutal, seductive queen, even the landscape, as we march east to meet the army in the Golden Cockerel, the landscape changes. And so here we have the intersection with sublime nature, right? We have these high peaks and these gorges, and nature itself sort of responds as we move east. And this is the pathetic fallacy of Romanticism, the idea that the outer world, the setting of the story, in some way reflects the inner nature of the characters or their inner emotional straits. I mean, that's the part of Romanticism as a genre. But the idea that even the landscape itself becomes sort of threatening and mysterious and so forth as we go east to meet our queen. And of course, the Golden Cockerel itself is an example of this kind of sublime nature, this kind of mysterious, powerful bird, right, that comes right out of nature to kill the Tsar, right? So yeah, I'd say that's kind of Those are the reviews, those are the main points. I think people did well on the discussion boards. I was a little nervous, right, about people sort of being cast on their own, so to speak, but I think it worked out pretty well. If you have lingering questions, you can just go ahead and email me, treat my email inbox like office hours, I guess. And then we'll just repeat this with the material. I'll set up a thread. I don't know why you can't set up thread. I don't know, it's whatever. And as far as grading goes, I don't even remember now if I mentioned this at the beginning of this video or not, whatever. As far as grading goes, I'm going to F around with that tomorrow because I need actually the grades that you earned on the individual recitation course websites to be on the main course website and the main spreadsheet. And I'm still working out how to, I'm probably just going to have to do that manually. But anyway, I'll sort that out tomorrow. So for grading purposes, if you want to see your grade for participation for these weeks, it'll still pop up eventually, once I figure all this out, in the main site for the course and not in the recitation website. So, all right, stay safe, wash your hands.